So now is another topic, but the things are of course related. Again, from the perspective of the Holocaust, and as you will later see, it is not just an issue of academic discussions, but also an issue which has to do with present-day discourses relating or dealing with anti-Semitism, and even, let's say, attempts to disconnect between the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, if it is possible, in a way. So, I would like to start with the concept of anti-Semitism. Again, some of us have been dealing with this intensively, others less, and perhaps others coming from entirely different fields are not aware of some of the historical aspects of anti-Semitism. We use the term anti-Semitism for Jew hatred. And yesterday was the question about anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism and so on. So we already feel the sensitivity. But I would like to start with something which is very recent. And you know, there is this organization, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, I-H-R-A, which is the name since 2005 what was before called the International Task Force on Holocaust Remembrance, Education, and Education. That was a project that resulted from a project that was initiated in 1998 by the Prime Minister of Sweden, a person who reacted to findings from a study on high school students in Sweden, and it was found that a high percentage of them held racist views. So he decided that it should be tackled, this issue, and he thought that it would be right to do through learning about the Holocaust. And he started he approached several countries. So as a politician, he thought about a political act, and he approached several states, Britain and Israel and Germany, with the first group, and then invited a lot of other people, and between 26th and 28th of January 2000, it was a huge convention in Stockholm with representatives from, I think, 46 states from all over the world, mostly European, but also from South America. And this organization was set up, and it is very active. The representatives meet twice a year, and there are several subcommittees, and there are supporting research and education and commemoration. Every member country, and there are now 27 member countries, is committed to a lot funding to these activities, and there are some other observer states and so on. So this is a huge organization, and on the 26th of May this year, that is 2.5 months ago, there was a proposed plenary decision regarding a non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism, which is based on former work, already in 2004, there was some working definition, and they adopted the following non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism, and now I quote: "Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities." And this is a definition which is non-legally binding, but nevertheless a definition guiding IRA in its work. And they give several illustrations. Now, this is of course for purposes of policies of governments and so on. But when we think about it, I think from a historical point of view, this is not enough to describe the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. Now, to define anti-Semitism is very difficult. We have, of course, also in the past had different scholars defining in a different way. And I would say that there are different levels within anti-Semitism. There is a physical attitude or attitude to the physical Jews, let's say, but there is also anti-Judaism, which relates to a certain idea. That idea, I'll relate to it because, like with the term ghetto, the idea changes. The semantics change over time. But now first to the term anti-Semitism is a very new term. Right? It emerged at the end of the 1870s, and it is usually attributed to a German journalist, Wilhelm Marr, who used the term in a booklet which was published in 1879. Though the term itself was in use before and can be found in writing by Moritz Steinschneider, who was a bibliophile. He was a scholar dealing with books, and that term was used in a reaction to studies by Ernst Renan. Ernst Renan was a French scholar in the field of linguistics, history, and also some biologistic views. Renan is very interesting scholar in the field of nationalism. Some of you deal with this issue. He wrote about what is nationalism in the 1880s. But he is also the person who, in the 1850s, introduced the term Semitism. People related to it because as a result of some scholarly findings which from the first half of the 19th century about the connections and actually being between several languages in the Middle East, having close connections and actually belonging to one family, right? He coined the term Semitic languages already in 1855, and in 1859 he, in another book, he spoke about Semitic peoples, right, with certain characteristics. Now the idea of language families is from the end of the 18th century, after the language Sanskrit was found in the 1760s in India, and people found that there was this deep connection between Sanskrit and European languages, and from there we have the Indo-European language idea, so that there is a family of languages with an original language, an Ursprache, right, which then develops and has children and grandchildren and so on. And when, in the beginning of the 19th century, with archaeological excavations in Iraq, in Mesopotamia, the Chaldean language, as it was called at the time, the language of the Castilians and Sumerian were found, and the affinity between that and Arabic and Hebrew and Aramaic were found. So again was the idea of a family of languages, and the idea at that time, and this has to do with the development of anthropology in the 18th and 19th century, that there is a full or that language is an expression of the character of the people who speak it. Therefore, there is a one-to-one overlapping of languages and peoples. Right? So when you move to another country and learn another language, it is not inherent to you. You can learn it, but it is not expressing your character. So this is already to do something to do with romantic ideas about language and character of a nation and so on. But it's important to remember that. So when Renan came with the idea of Semitic languages in the second half of the 1850s, and then with Semitic peoples, with certain character which is different from the Indo-European peoples. Right? And by the way, the term Aryan is from Sanskrit. Right? It designates the ruling elite, the pure ruling elite, so that is the origin of the term, but and this was then used by Germans and others in the new racist theories. But so we have these different peoples, different characters who speak different languages, and from that moment on we see the merger between racist ideas, racial ideas, and the history of Jew hatred. Right? So when Jew haters start to use racial ideas and this racial linguistic terminology, we suddenly have people who say, well, the terms that we used in the past are not right. And because we now speak about scholarly findings, hard proof, not ideas, not feelings, we have to replace the older term with a new one. So the term anti-Semitism or Antisemitism in German emerges in a certain circle of people, not among all Jew haters, but those who, and this is the first stage, who are involved with racial theories, who think in these new terms. And therefore we should here divide it or deconstruct the term into three parts, right? So we know Semit or Semit, yes, is now from this origin linguistic perception and ideas. Anti is the term that now replaced hatred, because I will give one quote. Those people said, we do not hate the Jews, but the Jews are different, essentially different. So it is something, we are anti, but it is not a feeling. It is, and I'll give the quote in a moment. And then we have the third part, which is ism. Ism is a theory, is a or a theory or a system, capitalism, liberalism, all the isms, right? Including Zionism, and so all these isms emerged in the political arena in the second half of the 19th century with the development of democracies and political parties and their translation into the ideas, the translation of ideas into the political arena. So anti-Semitism, when we see this ism, is a theory, but a theory which is also active in the political arena of the second half of the, or this last quarter of the 19th century. And that is very important to remember. Now,
Can I ask a question? I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I understand. So you're saying that anti-Semitism
replaces...
You know, I understand all that, but as a word, it was in the linguistic field without feeling.
It emerges from linguistic perception.
But anti-Semitism in particular.
Yeah.
Right?
So Renan said there are Semitic people, right? And the Semites per se in Europe are the Jews. Because at the time there were not too many migrants from the Middle East. So the Jews are the Semites per se. Now we get in the 1860s, in several years, it's 3-4 years after Renan publishes his second book, right, about the Semitic people, then we get already this reaction to Semitism.
Right. So
and then it is called Anti-Semitism.
Right, but I just have a very small, very specific question. And that is anti-Semitism, that word precedes Mar, and it's used non-politically.
Yeah, Steinschneider used it before him.
Okay.
But Wilhelm Marr definitely made it popular.
Yeah, okay.
Right? Yes?
Can I just clarify something also? The prior to Mar, the field of ancient Near Eastern languages was not clarified or identified as Semitic languages. It was just like Ugaritic and Akkadian. And
Ugaritic Ugaritic was found in 1929. So there were only several languages.
Early Egyptian or...
I'm going to intervene. Let Dan finish the lecture. We're going to have time for Q&A.
Okay. But if it's clarified,
Yeah.
okay, I'm okay with it, but it has to do with the development, of course, of linguistics, anyhow. And but the findings of the beginning of the 19th century of these languages, old languages which were forgotten in Iraq, in the southern part of Iraq, suddenly opened the eyes that, like with the Indo-European languages, we now have another group of languages, right? So, and that promoted the idea of Semitism. Now, the Wilhelm Marr, the person who starts to use this term in 1879, he was already an anti-Semite much earlier. And in 1862, he wrote a booklet which is called the Judenspiegel, the Jewish Mirror. And there it says the following: the reason is not why we are against the Jews, is not religious Jew hatred from one side, that is from the side of the non-Jews. Such hatred does not exist in well-educated people. It is the different nature of the essence itself. Das Fremdartige des Wesens selber, for those who know German, right? Which is chemically unbearable, if one can call it that way, and which causes it to be knocked off in an anorganic process, if we may call it so. So he said, our resistance to the Jews, our what we call it, what? Our being against, let's say, it's not yet a struggle. Our being against the Jews is not an issue of religion, because of the Jew having killed Jesus. It's not because of economic issues. There is something within the Jews, in the nature of the Jews, that when we meet them, our body reacts to it. It is something physical. So it is, and therefore, if it is so, it's not an issue of psychology, of hating the Jews. It is just a chemical or anorganic process. That's the terms that he used, right? So you can see that the issue of science is very important. It has to do with the development of science in the 19th century and the gaining a very important status. Science becomes yes, the new philosophy. People believe that science can solve every problem, right? And that is so the factual issues, the physical world, and so has answers for things that we until now dealt with in philosophical ways. So he says now this is how we relate to the Jews, and therefore we are not Jew haters, but we are anti-Semites. Now that is the origin of the term, and I think it's very important to understand that, because otherwise we cannot explain why in the 1870s there is a new term for the same thing. Right? We always, when we have a new word, smartphone, for instance, right? So there is something new which is not covered by the existing words that we have and terms that we have, so we invent something new. When we find a new term in history, we have to look for the reason that people coined these new words. So anti-Semitism, for the people themselves, for the anti-Semites, was something new, right? And they distantiated themselves from the older Jew haters. Because they said, for instance, we find it in several writings at the end of the 1870s and beginning of the 1880s, that is, for instance, an attack on Adolf Stöcker, who was who was a Jew hater, but from another brand, from the more traditional Christian Catholic approach, Protestant approach, and he was very anti-Semitic, but for him the solution that Jews would convert was there. Now the anti-Semites, the racial anti-Semites said, well, this is the worst solution you can have, because you, in this way, they change their religion, but they remain the same, and you insert and introduce these people into our race, right? So we are against the Christian Jew haters. We are against the socialist Jew haters, right? We have another explanation. We have to separate. And we have to find another solution for the Jewish question. So historically, anti-Semitism is a new stage in the development of the relations between Jews and non-Jews. And but what happened is that even though Wilhelm Marr actually disseminated this term in 1879, within 2-3 years, the term was taken up also by other Jew haters, and the anti-Semitism lost its original meaning and became a synonym for Jew hatred. Right? So now we can talk about racist anti-Semitism and economic anti-Semitism and Christian anti-Semitism, but historically that is wrong. Right? But this process or this development happened already shortly after the term was used for the first time. So this is the origin of the term, and I think that is important to remember, but when it is now used for a larger array of attitudes and solutions towards the problem of the Jews, we have to think about it as a family name. Right? So there is not one anti-Semitism as such, but there are anti-Semitisms. There are several ones, there are several presentations, different ones, more extreme ones, and those who put an emphasis on different issues, and that is for the Holocaust very important. I'll already say something about the Holocaust as I see it. Right? What happens during the Holocaust is not that it is just a Hitler enterprise, or even not just a German enterprise, because one of the questions is why so many people during this period participated in the project in different countries. Not all, of course, but there were many. Now some did it out of careerism and greed and so on, but we have many people with other types of anti-Semitism who join in, right? So what will happen during the Holocaust is that also non-Nazi types of anti-Semitism were radicalized. For instance, if we think about what happened in Romania, right? Romania was an independent state, it was an ally of Germany, but Romania and its leader actually caused the death of close to 380,000 Jews, and it was not a German act, right? It was done by the Romanians. So this is a question, then it is a question, and it's part of it. So what I want to say is that there are several types of anti-Semitism, and what will happen later on is that they are radicalizing a certain atmosphere which happens during the 1930s and 1940s. Now, the issue which was raised of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism and the hatred of Jews, and I read this definition, which was now accepted by the IRA, when it is the perception of Jews and so on, and Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and property into a Jewish community and so on. When we think about anti-Judaism, it's a bit different, because anti-Judaism has its origins in the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. Some people have dealt with this in the past. And within this context, Judaism is not only the Jews as such, but is an idea, is a different type of religion, right? But there is also the fight over who is the true Israel. It goes to the beginning of Christianity. The true Israel, according to the perception or to the interpretation of the church, is the Christians. Right? They are the true Israel, and the old Israel is not a true Israel anymore since the arrival of Jesus in the arena, on the scene. The chosenness was removed from the Jews to the Christians, and the Christians are the new Israel. Now, if therefore Jews are an old idea, an idea which is, well, now in the garbage bin of history, right? But the Jews are still there, and they are the carriers of a wrong idea, then we are on a different level. It's not only the Jews, but it is the idea that is carried by the Jews. And the idea as such, is also, or can cause harm and damage to the world. And in this context, I would propose, if you have time to read another of these thick books, there's a very interesting book by David Nuremberg, which was published in 2014, I think, Anti-Judaism, who traces back this idea of actually the Jews being viewed throughout centuries as standing for principle, for a certain principle or a certain idea. And Jews are defined as being different from all other peoples. Right? So a very important aspect is that there is the whole world and there are the Jews. So sometimes you have xenophobia and so forth, all kinds of people, right? And there are cases where Jews are part of this array of people that are disliked by in certain group. But anti-Semitism is the case where the anti-Semites puts the Jews apart from all other peoples. And the Jews are then the carriers of an idea which is harmful to the harmony of the world. Now this connects a bit with what Charles said yesterday. If the Israeli-Palestinian problem will be solved, or the state of Israel will be erased, then everything will be okay. Here you have something which relates to this old concept. But if we go back to the past, then we find in socialist or communist anti-Semitism or anarchist anti-Semitism that Jews are connected with money. Right? If we solve the problem, let's say there's an early writing by Marx himself. Marx was a converted Jew, but he speaks about Jews and mammon, Jews and money in a writing of 1843. And it said this problem, if the problem of money will be solved, then the Jews will also be liberated. Right? So the Jews are linked to the solution of problems of the world, and that is interesting because then, according to Nuremberg, also in the late medieval period and then in early modern times and later on, we find in changing situations that Jews are defined as, and Judaism is defined as the danger for world harmony. Now, when we think then about the Holocaust, right, and I'm making now a leap, I think this is a very essential issue in the understanding why the Third Reich was so eager to solve the problem of the Jews. Right? And why also so many people in different echelons of German society and then also outside Nazi Germany joined in. Because if we look upon it, we have to remember that the Third Reich existed only 12 years and 98 days, a very short period. Holocaust scholars are now trying to understand this period already for more than 7 decades. But the period itself was very short, definitely in historical terms. So there was some explosion of energy which happened, and the question is why that happened and why were so many people thinking that with getting rid of Judaism in general and the Jews in particular, problems of the world could be solved. The final solution of the Jewish problem is also the solution for larger problems that the world had, according to, of course, this anti-Semitic approach. So this is one story. This is the background of the idea of what I see as the importance of anti-Semitism and understanding the phenomenon. Judaism is a principle that can be, what principle exactly can change, but Judaism is a principle. Jews are the carriers of it, and we have to get rid of both of them. Right? So these are two layers. Now we come to another chapter, so we leave this aside now for a moment, and that is the issue of Holocaust and genocide studies. And now we are going to the realm of historiography. That is, and that is in the title. Has to do with the title. So my question is, and again, this is a good linguistic question, but also a historiographical question. What do we include in the term Holocaust? What is included when we talk about the Holocaust? The Holocaust, by the way, is a term which is a Greek term, and it has been throughout the ages, and since the beginning of the 1960s has become a popular term, first in the English-speaking world, and later on in other languages also, for the persecution and murder of the Jews. But since the end of the 1970s, the field of genocide studies has very much developed. Right? And some of the first scholars who started to deal with genocide studies in the in-depth way were first Holocaust scholars who tried to look for more general and universal implications of the Holocaust. But what happened over time is that the focus in genocide studies is on the murder. Now, if we look at a book, and I said some influential books, studies of the recent period, this is the book by Donald Bloxham, a British scholar, whose PhD thesis was about how the Holocaust was presented in the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. This is a 2008 book of his, The Final Solution, A Genocide, it's called. And what he says in the first sentences of the book, the three first sentences, between 5 million and 100,000 and 6 million and 200,000 Jews were murdered during the Second World War, an episode of the Nazis called The Final Solution of the Jewish Question. The world today knows it as the Holocaust. The subtitle I've chosen for this book, A Genocide, uses the indefinite article not to diminish the magnitude of the Holocaust, but to encourage the reader to think of it as a particular example of a broader phenomenon. Now, these texts that I'm going to read now, and you have them, I asked Michelle to make handouts, so, and there are still some for those of you who do not have them, so you can keep them, not only in your memory, but you have with you. And there are more copies here also. So what Bloxham says is the murder of the Jews is the final solution, is the Holocaust. Right? They are identical. You can use this or that. If you wonder about the numbers, 5,100,000 is the calculation of Raoul Hilberg from 1961, the book that we talked about this morning. 6,200,000 is the number which was calculated by a Jewish demographer in 1948, Jacob Leschinski. So sometimes you'll find it also in the literature. Nowadays, based on a lot of studies. We tend to think that it is between 5,600,000 and 5,900,000, perhaps closer to 5,900,000. At Yad Vashem, we now have the names of 4,600,000 about, but there are names that we will never find out. So that is for the numbers, but that is essentially not so essential here in the definition. So the murder, this comprehensive murder, is the final solution, is the Holocaust. Something. Now, if we look at another book, which was published in 2009, Hitler's Empire, How the Nazis Ruled Europe. Mark Mazower is a historian of 20th century history, very influential. And in this book, he has the following explanation. Right, of course, it is dealing with the Nazi expansion, especially eastwards. And from the title, you can learn already that his emphasis is on the empire, and he views Hitler in the tradition of major empires. But he says the following: the Nazis' main goal was to control Europe, and Hitler was nothing more than a greater German nationalist. That is for Sharon, we yesterday talked a bit. Nazi empire building was a form of colonialism, resulting from earlier examples, as Lebensraum, as living space, was in Europe's east. Eastern Europe must lie, and here at the heart of any account of the Nazi empire. And here are some of the sentences are mine, but the quotes are from him. So Hitler's imperial fantasy caused as a byproduct of the death of millions of Russians, Poles, Jews, and Belarusians. And in his book, he ignores the distinct nature of Nazi anti-Semitism. He says, well, okay, Nazis hated Jews, we know about it. That is something general. We don't have to explain it. But when they went to the east, they murdered a lot of groups, including the Jews. Therefore, he hardly relates to the deportation of Jews from Western Europe, Southern Europe, and even the first steps of the Germans in North Africa, in Tunisia, for instance. Right? What he also doesn't deal with at all is the 1930s. What happened with the persecution of the Jews in the 1930s in Germany and Austria. There are 2 paragraphs on that in his book, and then he jumps to, there is a whole chapter about the final solution in Eastern Europe. And then he says the Jews certainly occupied a special place in the political demonology of the Third Reich. But that's all what he says. And then he said, moreover, the Germans had somehow stumbled into the great centers of East European Jewry, somehow stumbled into the great centers of East European Jewry, and they had not foreseen that. Right? So the Jews constitute only one of the regime's ethnic targets. And it was thanks to Nazism that German soldiers and civilians ended up dying in numbers that were probably not far short of the toll of the final solution itself. So there were some 6 million German casualties, like 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust. So this is what he says. Now you can see that for him also, the Holocaust is the final solution, and mainly in Eastern Europe. Right? And what happened in the 1930s is not part of the story as such. And then you can proceed to I would say, the greatest bestseller in our field in recent years, and that is Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. And he presents, he actually says the Holocaust is not a story which you can put apart in a certain way, has no special characteristic. He is very much against identifying the Holocaust with Auschwitz. Said that is so popular in Holocaust literature, Auschwitz as an iconic presentation of the Holocaust, and said that's wrong. That's wrong because only a sixth, about 1 million people were murdered in Auschwitz. There were some other extermination camps, but the majority of the Jews were murdered in Eastern Europe as part of a much larger enterprise or a larger event of the murder of 14 million and 14.1 million civilians between central Poland and the Black Sea. So there is an area where in the period between 1933, start emphatically in 1933, between 1933 and 1948-49, more than 14 million civilians were murdered by two dictators, Hitler and Stalin. And this is a bloodbath in a certain area which he now calls bloodlands. And this term has become already very popular, although there was never such a geographical territory or a political territory or entity. There is no such area. He defined it as bloodlands, and from the beginning of his book, he relates to it as a reality. Right? As a reality. We quote perhaps. In the middle of Europe, in the middle of the 20th century, the Nazi and Soviet regimes murdered some 40 million people. The place where all of the victims died, the bloodlands. So this is in the preface at the end of the first page and beginning of the second page. Yeah? The bloodlands extend from central Poland to western Russia, through Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, during the consolidation of National Socialism and Stalinism, 33-38, the joint German-Soviet occupation of Poland, 39-41, and then the German-Soviet War, 1941-1945, mass violence of a sort never before seen in history was visited upon this region. The victims were chiefly Jews, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Poles, Russians, and Balts, the people native to these lands. The 40 million were murdered over the course of only 12 years, between 33 and 45, while both Hitler and Stalin were in power. And so on. So, what we see is that here he says you cannot define the Holocaust as a separate chapter, or distinct chapter within the period itself. It is part of a larger event, and in his conclusion, say the Germans and the Soviets, but actually it's Hitler and Stalin. He very much focuses on two leaders, right? Provoke one another to ever greater crimes. These atrocities share their place and they share the time, the bloodlet between 1933 and 1945. To describe their course has been to introduce to European history its central event. Right? So the event is not the Holocaust, is not World War II in general as such, but is the murder in these territories. Now, I said this has to do with development of genocide studies, because if we see in these studies that they are not or hardly related to what happened in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, right? And even during the first years after the beginning of World War II. And the focus is on what happened since 1941, and it's the murder. Holocaust is the murder, right, as we have seen. So, and the murder, and we have many murders. Then, and this is genocide. Right? Then the differences between the different genocides and the reasons behind them are downplayed. Now, so much so that even a British sociologist, Martin Shaw, in a book which was published in 2007, that is called "What is Genocide?" What is genocide? Right? He makes the case for a definition of the concept and understanding of the phenomenon of genocide through what he calls the structure of the conflict and not through the intentions of the perpetrators. So he said, when you deal with genocide, and there is a whole stream of scholars going with him, you don't have to ask for the intentions. Right? Intentions are not so important. They differ from one place to another. We have to look at the structure. There is a murder, and how is it done? And then we can put them together. Now, when we think about it in this case, of course, then there is a problem. Because, coming back now to anti-Semitism, and the question, why were Jews persecuted from the very beginning of the Third Reich? And not only in the bloodlands, but all over Europe, then you have to ask yourself the why question, right? It is not yet the murder, but something is going on, and very comprehensive. In a book that Vashem, whom we have mentioned, published in 2011, and jointly with Dirk Moses in the Oxford Handbook of Genocide Studies, in the introduction they say the following: the relationship between the study of the Holocaust and the study of genocide warrants reflection because it has been both negative and positive, characterized variously by synergies, processes of self-definition, by mutual exclusion, and occasional resentment. Did you understand that sentence?
Hardly.
Hardly, right? So it's very sophisticated. But actually what they allude to is the discussion about uniqueness of the Holocaust, right? If it is different, yes or no. And they say in a very sophisticated way and hard to understand that there is an issue of mutual exclusion, occasional resentment, but another scholar, an Australian genocide scholar, Colin Tetz, when being asked to write an article about the state of research in genocide studies in 2011, wrote the following: our maturing discipline needs to find a sense of collegiality, consensus on terminology, and yardsticks with which to measure scales, dimensions, and degrees of the crime. Foremost, and I'm emphasizing it, he did not do it in his article, but I'm doing it, foremost is the challenge of finding a space for encompassing and embracing the Holocaust with some comfort. The Judeocide is an ally, not an enemy, and not on the margins. So what a genocide scholar in 2011 found, that there's an enmity within the camp of genocide scholars toward the Holocaust. Right? Why? Because the claim is that scholars of the Holocaust and in the public commemoration cult, right? The Holocaust gets a higher place in the pyramid of remembrance than other cases, and suffering is suffering everywhere, and we have to put them all together when we speak about victims of persecution. Now, those who are acquainted with what is happening in the field of Holocaust commemoration, and will find that is, and in museums especially, that it's very common that we now speak Holocaust and genocide studies, Holocaust, genocide, and human rights. They're all put together, and that is, of course, a perspective, I would say, of present-day political use. But this is not an historical analysis of what happened. Now, if we go back to Lemkin and his definition of genocide. Lemkin is a Jewish lawyer, Polish-born, who succeeded in getting to the United States, and in 1943 coined a new term, genocide, right, which he then published in a book in 1944. And we have to know that Lemkin was already active in the 1930s in trying to find legal means to prevent the recurring of cases like the Armenian genocide. He was interested, and he wrote about it already in 1933. But now he was in the United States. He heard about his family and what was happening in Europe, and he coined this new term, and very much struggled afterwards to get it used. And the term can be found already in the Nuremberg trials in 1945-46, and then in 1948, a little bit different definition is taken up by the United Nations in the Convention for the Prevention of the Genocide from December 1948. But when we look at his definition, he says the following: genocide is a new term, a new conception for destruction of nations. New conceptions require new terms. By genocide we mean the destruction of a nation or an ethnic group. This new word, coined by the author to denote an old practice in its modern development, is made from the ancient Greek word genos and the Latin side side, or side, killing, thus corresponding in its formation to such words as tyrannicide, homicide, infanticide, etc. And then, generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accompanied by mass killings of all members of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundation of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objective of such a plan would be disintegration of the political and social institutions, of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of the personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of individuals belonging to such groups. Genocide is directed against the national group as an entity, and the actions involved and directed against individuals, not in their individual capacity, but as members of the national group. Genocide has two phases. One, destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. This imposition, in turn, may be made upon the oppressed population, which is allowed to remain or upon the journey alone. Now, what we have seen, what we have seen in this definition is that he emphasized that genocide is the attempt to eliminate nations, national groups. Lemkin thought in terms of nations. And that's the way it's also taken up by the United Nations. It's speaking in the Convention for the Prevention of Genocide. So the question is, regarding the Holocaust, if we should we should understand the persecution and murder of the Jews as killing the Jewish nation. Was that the intention, which brings us now back to the issue of anti-Judaism and anti-physical Jews? And before we take a break, now we have to, where's Charles? Now we need, or Michelle, now is the break, right? So again, like before, we'll leave a certain question. What did the Nazis try to do vis-a-vis the Jews? Right? And I remind you of this quote from Dieter Wislitzeny. Right? Is the Hexenwahn, is the witches mania, right? So there is something different going on, right, with the Jews, and we'll come back to that after the break.
So everybody please be back here